Now, we should address, I think, we've talked about collective remembrance, but I think we need to now associate to this the notion of private memory, and to think about what relationship these have. At one level, it seems perhaps obvious that there must be some kind of opposition between collective remembrance and private memory, because collective remembrance relies typically on very simple consensual narratives that have no place for the ambiguities and plurality of individual experience. There will be an array of different experiences that will contradict with one another, experiences that themselves will involve a very broad array of emotions and feelings, and this doesn't seem to be easily reconcilable with the very simple narratives that are generally constructed collectively about the past. But that being said, collective remembrance cannot, in a sense, operate at a complete remove from individual experience and personal memory. It has to at least partially echo it if it is to be sustained, if it isn't to be a completely artificial construct, maybe upheld by state diktat, but ultimately with no real imprint on individuals. Because if collective memory is to really operate, it has to be sustained partly through the internalization of individual memories. So that collective remembrance has to in some ways reflect some sense of personal experience. But conversely, personal experience may be also very difficult to articulate and express without a certain repertoire of narratives or a certain cultural framework of intelligibility. There's going to be some cultural references, some wider social narratives in which individuals will seek to make sense of their own personal experience. This is all to say that remembrance has both a political and psychological dimension. The political dimension is one that we've already discussed, the ways in which remembrance can be or is used to bind citizens into collective national identities. But the psychological dimension is also very significant, because remembrance of wars is deeply tied into loss and into grief. And remembrance has to in some way be an expression of popular mourning. As Ashblunt, Dawson and Roper put it, the politics of war memory and commemoration always has to engage with mourning and with attempts to make good the psychological and physical damage of war. And wherever people undertake the task of mourning and reparation, a politics is always at work. So therefore the remembrance of a cause and of abstract self-sacrifice for it is often intertwined in individuals with the remembrance of specific fallen persons. At the individual level, grieving, the mourning of a loss, is something that generally calls forth among individuals for meaning. We find it very difficult psychologically to accept death without purpose, without meaning, without some form of redemption. And we can see this in the ways in which individuals try to cope with the loss of a loved one. A loss that might appear completely senseless, but people want to transcend any notion of senselessness by saying, maybe by in some ways transcending it by saying they didn't die for nothing, even if it might mean that we can draw a lesson from this, that someone won't suffer from this. So parents who lose children campaigning for whatever the causes of that death were. We find there are deep psychological needs for associating meaning and purpose to the human trauma of loss. And of course, in the context of war, national narratives or collective forms of remembrance provide this kind of framework for meaning. Your son, your partner did not die in vain. They died for a greater cause or for a greater purpose. And because of this complex entanglement of the personal and the collective, the psychological and the political, forms of collective remembrance are inherently sites of negotiation and contestation between different actors, whether the state or originating in civil society, which is to say that various individuals, various non-state civil society groups, and the state themselves will generally have to resolve the various demands at play, political, psychological, and so forth, in conceiving of particular forms of commemoration. Which is to say that we have to we can't simply stop at the idea that states instrumentally promote memory and that can explain every form of commemoration, because when we look at it more in closer detail, we can see the ways in which the state also in some ways is steered and buffeted by demands that come from the bottom up. So that commemoration is not only something that comes from the top, from the state. There are also more spontaneous local forms of commemoration, and often the major sites of memory find themselves at the crossroads of both these top-down instructions to commemorate and these bottom-up demands for remembrance. And therefore it's not surprising that actually when we look at many forms of collective remembrance, these emerge through the actions of civil society, where whether it be members of social networks such as veterans or victims of war that build up support within public opinion for particular forms of commemoration. A very good example here is the Whitehall Cenotaph, as I've said before, or the centerpiece really of commemorations, war commemorations in this country. Now, originally, it was designed as a temporary structure. It was made of wood and plaster. It was intended to be displayed as just one of the displays for the Peace Day Victory Parade of 1919. It was designed to be an empty tomb. That's what a cenotaph is. An empty tomb to commemorate the dead that could not be repatriated. So many dead were, of course, buried in northern France and Belgium and so forth. It was to be a very sober display with a sole inscription of the glorious dead. Now, what happened is that on the occasion of the parade, the structure drew a lot of public attention. It's estimated that up to 1.2 million people flocked to it within a single week, and huge quantities of flowers were laid at its base. So that, although the parade contained many other features, it was the cenotaph that really struck a chord among the public. Very quickly, a decision was taken to replace it with a permanent monument that was unveiled on the following Armistice Day in 1920. And the photograph on the right presents this occasion. Now, what's significant here is that originally the authorities were pushing this Peace Day Victory Parade. They wanted to celebrate the ending of the war in quite triumphalist terms. It was a great British victory, but actually that did not reflect the public mood, who of course the public had lost. The numbers of fatalities were terrible. Families had lost precious close ones in countless numbers, and in fact, what the mood of the country was for a much more somber commemoration, one that was centered on loss and grief. And this is what made the cenotaph the centerpiece of commemoration, and the state in this case very much adapted to that. Perhaps in some ways recuperated it, but was guided by the public sentiment rather than its ability to dictate from the outset the ways in which the war would be remembered. Much more modestly, there's a parallel with the 2014 Tower of London poppy installation that we see here. A sea of poppies, that of course recalls a sea of blood. This was a very popular attraction when it was displayed 7 years ago, and again, it was a case of an exposition that was extended following a very sustained public and media campaign. So once again, the mood of the public sometimes exceeds that of the state or the official authorities behind commemoration, and public pressure can lead to commemoration taking a different turn, or being extended, or refracting in ways that were not necessarily intended. All of this is actually quite revealing of something that happens in the First World War. And the First World War is, as many other ways in the history of war, is a pivot in terms of the commemoration of war. Previously to the First World War, war monuments tended to be celebratory. And perhaps there's no better example than the triumphal arches that were commonly erected. The most famous, of course, being the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, erected in 1836 to celebrate Napoleon's victories on victories of the French Revolution as well. Itself was an echo of a much older arches. There were Roman arches erected to celebrate various victories of Roman military leaders and the Roman Empire. There's several arches, of course, in Britain as well. For example, the Wellington Arch, erected in 1825, the Marble Arch, and so forth. So this was very commonly in the 19th century, was the creation of these arcs or triumphal arcs intended to celebrate great victories. And this probably is the dominant ways in which wars were remembered until the turn of the 20th century. Because the First World War marks a transition towards a more reflective type of memorial site, with an emphasis on human loss and grief, exemplified, as I say, by the cenotaph. The First World War is nonetheless a kind of a hinge, because we still see a number of more traditional sites as well, some even reaching back to deep ancestral celebrations. A particularly interesting one is the pyramid of 12,000 German helmets that was erected in front of Grand Central Terminal in New York in 1919. And here we should quote from Elias Canetti's Crowd and Power, when he's talking about the ways in which, at a very primal level, the wishes for the warring wish to see the enemy as a heap of dead. The aim of the battle, he says, is to silence the other side. Their loud and united voice is a threat rightly feared. When they have all been cut down, it is silenced forever. The stillest crowd is the crowd of enemy dead. The more dangerous they were, the stronger the desire to see them in a motionless heap. The experience of seeing them thus, as a defenseless heap of dead, evokes an intense and peculiar emotion, for it was only a short time before that they were experienced as a living host, which fought and shouted for blood. So really a very kind of primeval kind of celebration, where the helmets of the Germans stand for the bodies of the dead. This, of course, is a kind of commemoration that we would no longer see today. And in the First World War, they still appear, but they are in the process of being eclipsed by these much more somber and reflective sites of memory. Ones that particularly put the sacrifice of the common soldier at the fore. Again, a very important kind of a shift here is away from the celebration of the general, the military leaders, the great men. This was the ways in which wars prior to the First World War were commemorated. You built a column to Admiral Nelson, for example, in Trafalgar Square when you want to commemorate that battle. But with national armies and with wars of national interest, rather than dynastic wars fought by mercenaries, the experience of the common man becomes increasingly recorded and recognized. And of course, the role of literacy here plays a big role, because increasingly from the First World War onwards, we start having written testimony and recollections of the average soldier, which was something that was much rarer, of course, in an age of reduced literacy. Most emblematic of this, I think, is the emergence of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This is a tomb which contains the remains of an unidentifiable soldier, and that is expected to stand for all unknown soldiers. And ultimately, this is a site or a fixture which is intended to symbolize the sacrifice of the anonymous masses. And tombs of the unknown soldier that were first established in France and the UK after the war have since spread across the world. There can't be many countries that don't have their own tomb of the unknown soldier, and generally these serve as important focal points in commemoration. In France, the tomb of the unknown soldier is under the Arc de Triomphe, a nice counterpoint between the triumphalism and the sacrifice of the common man. Is an interesting point to be made here, though, is that it may well be that the era of the unknown soldier has come to an end. In 1998, the unknown soldier for the Vietnam War was identified through his DNA in the US, and consequently his body was removed and he was buried no longer as an unknown soldier, but very much as a known individual. And the development of contemporary DNA techniques or DNA forensics suggests that actually the whole premise of an unknown soldier is going to become impossible, because you could identify someone with the smallest remains, and so therefore the unknown soldier is perhaps something that we won't see anymore. But we already have, of course, these unknown tombs or tombs of the unknown soldier peppered across the world, and they still remain, of course, an important commemorative fixture. One of the other things we see, again, emerging in the First World War is the idea of the absolute equality of the dead. Individual, identical graves are commonplace. We see lists of the dead with no mention of rank. There is a kind of democracy of the fallen. And this is, I think, one of the important traits of commemoration in the period of the 20th century and beyond, that effectively collective remembrance is democratized. It's extended to encompass everyone, the common soldier, not simply prominent leaders. Summing all up, it's important to note here that therefore that the forms and motifs of remembrance are increasingly the product of negotiation between multiple actors, including the state, and that we find different narratives and counter-narratives in circulation, and that the forms of commemoration that emerge, the types of monuments that are erected, are in a sense a result of these conflicting or these shifting, potentially opposing narratives that are present. We can see this again with another, I think, very interesting example, which is the Vietnam War Veterans Memorial, the famous black wall that you can see in Washington, D.C. Now, this was a memorial that was very much initiated by the veterans movement. It was not initiated by Congress. Politicians as a whole just wanted to forget about the Vietnam War in the years that followed. It is said, one particular veteran that began the campaign, having been inspired by the Vietnam War movie The Deer Hunter. And as a result of the campaign, the monument opened up in 1982 and has become the centerpiece of commemoration of the Vietnam War, an iconic war memorial across the world. It was, however, a controversial one. There was a lot of dispute around the design, and therefore over the meaning conveyed about what the memory of Vietnam should be. Some veterans and politicians argued that the wall was too somber, that it placed too much emphasis on the sorrow and shame of the war. Others liked it precisely for that reason. It's certainly the very opposite of a triumphalist monument. It is very simple, it is very bleak, it is very but Very interestingly, of course, was that the furor that followed, the hostility expressed in some quarters, was such that it was eventually agreed to place a sculpture with more traditional heroic overtones facing the wall. This is the so-called Three Soldiers, which was erected in 1984, and which you can see facing the wall. These are, much more conventional composition. There's an interesting choice of ethnicities here, since one of the soldiers is Caucasian, the other is African American, and the last is Hispanic. So a very purposeful representation of various ethnic communities that participated in the war, and served to soothe some of the unhappiness in some quarters about the darkness of the original monument. The sculpture behind the Three Soldiers attempted very much to reconcile these conflicting memories. When he described the war and the relationship of his work to it, he writes, "I see the wall as a kind of ocean, a sea of sacrifice that is overwhelming and nearly incomprehensible in the sweep of names. I place these figures upon the shore of that sea, gazing upon it, standing vigil before it, reflecting the human face of it, the human heart." And so the Vietnam War memorial is very interesting because in some ways it embedded in the architecture of it, in the design of the monument, in the two opposing pieces that we find displayed, we can really read in many ways the politics of memory at play, the kind of different narratives and pressures under which these monuments were erected, the kinds of competing narratives about them, the disagreements about how the wall should be commemorated, and perhaps some attempt to transcend that and find some kind of synthesis, right? Some kind of way that could bring everyone together, that could see this is a united site of memory. And this is a kind of reading that you can perform absolutely with other types of monuments, and that's one of the things we'll try and do as well in the seminar.